What's up gamers, DreamcastGuy here, talking today about the PlayStation Vita. It's hard to believe, but it's already been 6 years since this amazing handheld came out, and it's really interesting. It's something that really revolutionized the handheld game market with its great shooters, fantastic RPGs, and big catalog of early PlayStation titles, but what's also kind of fascinating is just how badly it flopped. This thing didn't sell great, and quickly after launch, even Sony seemed to have abandoned it. So today, I want to take a deep dive look of everything that was awesome about this handheld and what eventually got it killed. In early 2012, store shelves were being flooded by Sony's new little experiment, the PlayStation Vita, something that they claimed would have console-quality games but on the go. This was a really bold idea, and up to this point it had never been done before. There was always a distinct line in the sand between what people considered a handheld game and what people considered a console game. Now, I love the PSP, I think it's one of the best consoles ever made, but let's face it, the things that came out on there, no matter how amazing they were very clearly skimmed down. The games had to be smaller, the adventures shorter, and the graphics of course a lot less shiny. The Vita was something that claimed that it wouldn't have to make these compromises. With its new twin joystick controls, bigger screen, and really powerful graphics card, it seemed like this is the thing that could really do it. The Vita seemed like it was going to be unstoppable, and at launch, it had a lot of positive hype. Stuff like Gravity Rush, where you're actually tilting the console itself to fly around a city, and Uncharted Golden Abyss, letting us go on a full-scale adventure but on our little handheld, was an amazing blurring of the lines. This felt like the future of gaming in our hands, and I really thought at that point that this thing was going to be a shoe-in for easy victory. Something I think that majorly helped the PlayStation Vita early on is that it was just so backwards compatible. There were hundreds and hundreds of early PS1 games being put on this, along with tons of ports of PSP games being available digitally. If you look at mine here, you can see that I have about 15 massive RPGs installed at once. Everything from Xenogears to, of course, the giant Final Fantasy VII. The Vita quickly gained a reputation as an RPG machine, something that if it was fully charged could entertain you for hours and hours and hours. And that's what I think was where it should have just stuck. Really kind of focus and double down on that, but they sort of muddied the waters. It seemed like Sony themselves weren't exactly sure what to do with the Vita. Even as the RPG fans really started to take it up, there were some games that sort of just turned gamers off, like Escape Plan. Now, don't get me wrong, this game is really fun to play and I think it's a good puzzler, but it had you use the front and rear facing touchscreens. It was something that clearly existed just because of the hardware itself. It tried to just be innovative in a way that nobody really asked for. The Vita is truly best when it just sticks to typical gaming. Not just role-playing games, but in general. The games that were the best on it were usually the indie games that just played things straight. Fez and Hotline Miami were things I probably put hundreds of hours into, eating up weeks of my life, playing levels over and over and over again because it was the giant console experience I always craved, but on the go. The more they tried to introduce games that were just pointlessly innovative or required you to turn on the camera of the Vita itself, I felt like it lost focus. Thankfully, the independent gaming scene on this handheld was insanity. There are literally thousands of games you can download on this, everything you can imagine, and that is where I think this thing really stood out. In fact, I would go so far as to say that the big reason that the Vita ever sold as long as it did is because of third-party support. Indie developers who are willing to take the time and figure out all the little intricacies of programming so they could bring games that, in my opinion, are staggeringly giant to such a tiny platform. I mean, just taking a second here to look at Dragon's Crown. This thing is running on a Vita, and this is a humongous beat-em-up brawler. Something that's made to be played with friends or by yourself and get all sorts of cool upgrades and all sorts of great items. This thing is a massive experience and something I don't think ever would have been possible on such a gadget if people weren't so dedicated to it. The fan base that surrounds the PlayStation Vita is so die-hard. Some people have even started buying shirts that say "Welcome to Vita Island" and really kind of throwing everything they've got towards this thing. Everybody, including myself, believed that this was specifically the future of gaming. Stuff where you could play a massive game on the go. And Sony sort of tried to support this, but not in the best way possible. They started to change all the marketing about halfway through its console life and say, hey, yeah, you should buy a Vita because it's great to go with your PlayStation 4. They started treating it like a peripheral, and this is where I think things went bad. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it's awesome to be able to play freaking Fallout 4 on my couch on a tiny screen and then pick it up and go right back to playing it on the console itself, but I think that that's not the reason people were buying this. People wanted the Vita for Vita games. People want the Vita for RPGs. People aren't wanting the Vita because they can stream PS4 games. Another problem that popped up was canceled games. A lot of times there were these big budget projects that were shown off and then just quietly canceled later on. An example of this would be BioShock Vita. That was something that Ken Levine himself was really passionate about, displaying that this is a system that developers need to take seriously. The twin sticks make it great for shooters, but on top of that, it showed that the graphical capabilities in this hardware actually could just handle so much. The fact that that got canceled specifically really killed some hype early on, and seeing it happen again and again, it sent a bad message. As projects began to get canceled and some of the positivity died down, sales slumped off hardcore, and I think another big part of this is because of the price point. People are willing to buy stuff as long as it's cheap enough, and this is a lesson that Nintendo learned the hard way. When they originally got out the 3DS, it was overpriced and didn't have a big enough library of games, and so because of it, it was actually sitting on store shelves with dust collected on it. That's when Nintendo clearly had a giant meeting and realized that they needed to drop the price to survive, and doing so clearly worked. Sony, on the other hand, refused to drop the price of the Vita for years, and I just don't understand why. This thing, at launch, cost $250 for a base model Vita, one that was just able to play games. If you wanted it to be able to do online play via your cell phone plan, that would cost you $300. But wait, it gets worse. In order to actually install games and have a bunch of great stuff that's digital, you are going to need a memory card, a giant internal memory stick. These would cost you an additional $100 on average, which means if you wanted a standard Vita with a standard memory card, you were going to be paying a minimum of $350 before tax. That is so ridiculously expensive. That means if you're the type of person who was excited around release and wanted to try and get the system itself and a couple digital games, you are going to be easily spending over $400. At this point, they were doing sales all the time for the PlayStation 3, so unfortunately, that became a competitor for themselves. Sony was just not listening to feedback properly. They should have heard people saying, "We want the Vita, we just want it cheaper," but they would not listen. There was an interesting side effect to this though, and it's something I don't see anybody else talk about. Because this thing cost about as much as a full-fledged console, the people who bought the Vita ended up sticking with it very, very hardcore and actually supporting it to a massive degree. The average Vita owner bought 12 games. That is a crazy attach rate. There were all sorts of reports being written that people who were making indie games and ported to the Vita were actually seeing that version outsell every other version of it. The people who played on Vita were the most hardcore fan base, but they were also the people who were being squeezed the hardest by Sony themselves. While this company is famous for being so smart with how they handle their hardware, with the Vita, it just seems strange that they kept going silent on it. They'd come out on stage and show 5 or 6 games, and then never do any follow-up, or instead, they'd try and do a giant presentation specifically dedicated to the Vita, and then not actually show any gameplay. By the time E3 2015 rolled around, it seemed like Sony had just flat out given up. They wouldn't even mention it anymore, and it left more Vitas sitting around unplayed. The people who wanted this just needed games to buy, and clearly they had the money to buy them, but Sony themselves didn't seem interested in supporting it. Now, it does honestly suck that so many games got denied even beginning development, like an infamous game that was going to be on the Vita, but I do have to say, I really respect that Sony was smart enough to see what was selling and stick with it. In this case, we're talking RPGs out the butt. There were so many of them, and a lot of games that were really good ended up getting ported to this. One great example of this is freaking Persona 4 Golden. This game was relatively obscure before this port, and now it is considered one of the best RPGs ever made. This is completely because of Sony's smart decision making. They realized, okay, we can push this, we can advertise it, and we can make it something to really sell our system. And it worked. And it actually ended up inspiring tons more people to come forward and start developing indie games that were sort of in that style. There were basically shockwaves throughout the independent game development scene after Persona 4 Golden came out, and we saw all sorts of more artistic titles coming forward, and that's fantastic. The Vita, at the end of the day, is something that always struck me because it wanted to be different. The games were fun, the touchscreens were really functional, and games like Tearaway were phenomenal. At no point when I owned my Vita did I regret it. I kept playing it, and to this day, I still check the storefront to try and find what new backwards compatible games are being added to it. The PlayStation Vita did so many things correctly, and I still think that it's such a groundbreaking handheld. We do exist in an era now with the Nintendo Switch, and it is going to be a harsher battle, but I don't think it's too late. PlayStation needs to make something else handheld. They need to try and enter this space again, and I don't care what it takes, they need to do it. As we go further into the future and basically all third-party support is dying out for the Vita, I just want to say, the Vita lived. Those of us who jumped on the bandwagon early had a hell of a ride, and I'm glad I was there for it. This is something I hope will be remembered throughout all history as being unique and just so damn fun. Well guys, this has been the good, the bad, and the ugly of the PlayStation Vita, a system that I think is still pretty mind-blowing even in 2018. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all and keep dreaming. I have to do a giant, very special thank you to all my Patreon supporters. This video exists because of you. I bought a lot of the games that I record in this video. A lot of the equipment is all bought with Patreon money. So really, I could not have done this without you. But specifically to one of my Patreon supporters named Frankly My Dear. When I got this Vita mailed to me, this is actually the second one I had to order. When I got the first one, it was stolen, unfortunately. So a Patreon supporter reached out to me and mailed me one of his spares. So thank you. Seriously, if you see that guy in the comment section, frankly, I owe you a giant special thank you. You are the best, and thank you, thank you, thank you. Now, I'm gonna go keep playing some Vita, and you know, I don't care if Sony may have turned their back on this system, but I'm sure as hell not doing it. Oh, hey, I was just playing a little bit of Grand Theft Auto on my Darth Vader PSP. Are you curious what I'm going to come out with next? Well, if you click this button, you'll be subscribed to be the first to know. Also, if you click over here and here, you can see my latest review and my latest top 10. I promise, it was super good. Or it was really bad, and I'm sure you can just make fun of me in the comments. Either way, it'll be a lot of fun. Thanks so much for watching.